This is a made-up story meant to be fun. Please leave a comment below to let us know where you are watching from. It's always interesting to see how far these stories can go. The postmaster in Cornish, New Hampshire, saw something strange on the morning of March 22, 1931. The Elbridge family lived on a remote farm about 7 miles northeast of town and hadn't picked up their mail in 3 weeks. Varian Elbridge, a man known for his being on time and following a schedule. Josiah T-Main, the postmaster, was a methodical man who kept a daily log of the letters he received. One letter from a Boston law firm seemed to be urgent. By the 4th week, T-Main was worried about the silence and called the county sheriff. The Elbridge property was at the end of a narrow dirt road that went through thick woods and ended in a clearing where the farmhouse stood in front of Mount Escotney. The house was built in 1847 and had 2 stories. It was made of granite from the area and had a slate roof that had been through many New England winters. County records showed that the property was about 80 acres, most of which was forested. It had a small barn, a root cellar, and what locals called the Old Quarry House, which was a smaller stone building that was built decades before the main house. On the afternoon of April 14, 1931, Sheriff Harlan Voss and Deputy Malcolm Henry arrived at the property. The county's medical examiner is Dr. Lionel Stratton. The things they found would go down in New Hampshire law enforcement history as one of the most well-documented but still inexplicable cases. The door to the farmhouse was slightly ajar. Everything inside looked perfectly organized, as if the people who lived there had just stopped what they were doing and never come back. There were still 3 place settings on the table in the kitchen. The food had been rotten for a long time. There were beds made upstairs with military precision. Clothes were neatly hung up in the closets. Things that belonged to people stayed in drawers. But there were no people, no bodies, no signs of a fight or forced entry. Just a heavy silence that seemed to come from the walls and a smell that Dr. Stratton would later describe in his report as being like damp earth, and something else I couldn't put my finger on. Not decomposition, but maybe the smell of people living there for a long time suddenly stopped. Bark. The file for the official investigation. The New Hampshire State Archives has detailed lists of the property that were first kept at the Grafton County Courthouse and then moved there. Sheriff Voss was very thorough when he wrote things down. The house had all the furniture that a family with a moderate income would need. There was a parlor with horsehair furniture, a dining room with a mahogany table, and bedrooms with iron bedsteads and oak dressers. In Varian Elbridge's study, they discovered meticulously kept account books documenting farm expenditures and money made from selling maple syrup and wood. The last entry was made on March 1, 1931. You need to know who the Elbridge family was in order to understand what happened to them. In 1931, Varian Elbridge was 47 years old and the 3rd generation of his family to live on the farmstead. Jedediah Elbridge, his grandfather, bought the land in 1842 because he was interested in the granite quarrying that was going on in the area at the time. The family moved on to farming and forestry when the quarries closed in the 1870s. Agriculture and forestry. Nathaniel Elbridge, Varian's father, died in 1919, and Varian inherited the property. His death was officially recorded as being caused by pneumonia, but a note in the doctor's record said that he had unusual symptoms before his breathing stopped. In 1910, Varian married Imogene Prescott. She was the daughter of a merchant from Manchester who went to a private school for girls. Everyone said she was an unlikely match for a farmer from the rural areas of Grafton County. Letters. According to the estate papers, Imogene's father set up the marriage to pay off debts that Varian's father owed. In a letter to her sister dated November 1910, Imogene wrote, "I have agreed to father's arrangement, though I confess the prospect fills me with no joy. The farmstead is remote beyond description, and Mr. Elbridge is a man of few words and fewer smiles, but Father assures me this is the proper course, and I have been raised to be beautiful. The couple had no children, which is noted often in the letters between Imogene and her sister who stayed in Manchester. In a letter from 1918, Imogene wrote, "Varian often talks about duty and the legacy of keeping what his grandfather built. He is becoming more and more obsessed with the idea of preservation, though I admit I don't always understand what he means. He has been spending a lot of time in the old quarry house, which he has turned into what he calls his archive. When I ask him about his work there, he says only that he is safeguarding the family history." The third member of the household was Varian's younger brother, Thaddeus Elbridge, who had returned from the Great War in 1919 with injuries that left him with a pronounced limp. And what period? Medical records, euphemistically termed nervous exhaustion. Thaddeus moved to the farmstead in 1920, ostensibly to assist with the property's management. Letters from Imogene to her sister mention Thaddeus only sparingly, and when she does, the Thaddeus is still with us, and Varian says he needs him, even though I find his behavior strange. He doesn't say much, but I often feel his eyes on me. At night I hear him pacing in the room above me for hours and hours before the footsteps stop. According to census records and tax assessments, these 3 people made up the whole household. They didn't have any live-in servants, but a woman from town named Harriet Cullen came twice a week to help with laundry and heavy cleaning. Mrs. Cullen gave some of the most detailed accounts of life at the Elbridge farmstead in the months leading up to the disappearance. In an interview with Sheriff Voss on April 15, 1931, which is still in the case file, Mrs. Cullen said, "I worked for the Elijahs for 8 years, and I can say with certainty that household grew stranger as time passed. Mr. Varian was always a strict person who stuck to his schedule, but his behavior has become more rigid in the last few years. Everything had to be exactly how he wanted it. Mrs. Imogene had to make meals at the right times. The house had to be kept in perfect shape. He kept track of everything in account books, including every penny spent and every task done. I once saw him use a ruler to check the distance between things on a shelf to make sure they matched a drawing he had made." Mrs. Cullen went on, "But the silences were what struck me the most. When I first started working there, the house felt like any other house with thee. It was the usual sounds of daily life. But over the years, the silence grew. People stopped talking to each other. Mrs. Imogene would go days without saying more than she needed to. Thaddeus hardly spoke at all. The only person I heard regularly was Mr. Varian, and even then it was usually to give instructions or corrections. The house felt heavy, as if the air itself had weight. When I asked Mrs. Cullen about specific events, she mentioned several that she found disturbing. In January of this year, I arrived to find all the mirrors in the house covered with black cloth. When I asked Mr. Varian why, he said it was necessary and that I shouldn't take the coverings off. Mrs. Imogene seemed especially upset about this, but she didn't say anything when her husband was around. Another time, I found what looked like locks on the outside of the bedroom doors, not the inside where you would expect them for privacy. I asked Mrs. Imogene about this directly, and she looked at me with such fear that I never asked her again, brought up the subject again. The most disturbing story Mrs. Cullen told was about an event that happened in late February. I was finishing my work in the kitchen when I heard loud voices coming from upstairs. This was strange because arguments were never public in that house. I heard Mrs. Imogene say, "We can't keep going like this, Varian. What you ask is not right," and his response was cold as winter. "You will do as is required. We are bound by more than marriage vows. You knew the terms." Then I heard footsteps, followed by a door closing. Mrs. Imagigene came downstairs later and her eyes were red, but she didn't say anything about the argument. Mrs. Cullen last visited the farm on March 6, 1931. She noticed that the family was even more withdrawn than usual. She finished her work and left, planning to come back on March 13th. But on March 12th, a boy from town brought her a note written in Varian Elbridge's exact handwriting that said, "Your services will not be needed for the foreseeable future. For the time being. Payment for work completed will be forwarded." The note was dated March 10th. Mrs. Cullen kept this note, and it was later entered into evidence as Exhibit C in the investigation file. The investigation into the disappearance uncovered several curious details about Varian Elbridge's activities in the months preceding the family's vanishing. Bank records from the First National Bank of Lebanon showed that beginning in November 1930, Varian had withdrawn substantial sums of cash totaling nearly $3,000 by early March 1931. The bank manager, when interviewed, noted that such withdrawals were unusual for a farmer whose transactions typically involved small amounts. When the manager had inquired about the purpose, Varian replied only that he was settling accounts. More intriguing were records discovered at the county courthouse indicating that in December 1930, Varian had filed a petition to have the old quarry house officially designated as a separate structure on the property deed with specific provisions that it would stay sealed and undisturbed forever. The petition was denied because it was not legally enforceable, but the very attempt raised questions. What was in the quarry house that Varian wanted to protect so completely? When Sheriff Voss and his team looked at the quarry house on April 14th, they found it secured with a new padlock. When they forced their way in, they found a single, large room that had been turned into what could only be called an archive or study. The walls were lined with shelves holding bound ledgers, journals, and collections of documents. A big table in the middle of the room was covered in papers, pictures, and what looked like family trees. There was also a cot in one corner, which showed that someone had spent a lot of time there. The documents found in the quarry house would keep investigators busy for months. The ledgers went back to 1842 and were kept by different generations of Elbridges, recording not just financial matters, but she wrote down a lot of information about the property, the land, and what Jedediah Elbridge called the duty of stewardship. One entry from 1844 said, "The land demands acknowledgement." The things that were here before us are still here in some way. We have to keep the agreement, or else we might lose the foundation itself. This mysterious reference to an agreement showed up many times in the journals over the years. Varian's own entries, which took up most of the more recent volumes, became more and more obsessive. He kept track of daily rituals, property boundary measurements, and long notes on how to keep what he called the equilibrium. He wrote in an entry from October 1930, "The terms must be met exactly as stated. I have looked over the papers left by grandfather and there can be no deviation. The others must understand. Imaging resists, but resistance is futile. That comprehends, though he fears. Fear is irrelevant when duty is absolute." Among the papers was a letter never, sent to Imagigene's sister in Manchester, written in Varian's hand. It was written on February 20th, 1931, and said, "If anyone asks about our household, know that everything that was done was necessary and correct. The Elbridge legacy requires sacrifice, and those who understand the covenant have made that sacrifice willingly. Imagine will come to terms with it in time. That has already been submitted. I am just the instrument of something much older than myself. Yer Rima," the investigation also found. Correspondence between Varian and a Boston law firm, Cavendish and Halt, regarding the establishment of a trust. The lawyers confirmed that Varian had contacted them in January 1931, seeking to establish an irrevocable trust that would maintain the property in perpetuity, with specific instructions that neither the farmhouse nor the quarry house were ever to be altered or demolished. The trust was never finalized, however, as Varian had failed to appear for the final signing scheduled for March 20th, 1931. Investigators were especially interested in a series of photos found in the quarry house. Varian himself took the pictures with a box camera, and they showed different parts of the property, such as the foundation stones of the farmhouse, trees with notches on them, the entrance to the root cellar, and the inside of the quarry house. But what got people's attention was a series of photos that seemed to show the same scene. The rear wall of the root cellar taken over the course of several months. Each new picture showed the wall getting wetter and wetter. In the last pictures, the stones seemed to have moved, leaving a narrow gap. The root cellar was behind the farmhouse and could be reached by a slanted wooden door set into the ground at a 45-degree angle. On April 15th, Chervos and his team went down into the cellar. It was about 12 feet square, with walls made of stacked granite and a hard-packed dirt floor. The air inside was cold and damp, with that same strange smell that Dr. Stratton had noticed in the house. The back wall, as shown in the variance photos, did show signs of stone movement. The investigators used lanterns to look through the gap, but all they could see was darkness. Deputy Henry suggested making the gap bigger to look into it more. They used tools from the barn to remove a few stones, making an opening big enough for a man to walk through. Sheriff Voss's official report documented what they found beyond the wall. Report, though the description remained somewhat vague. Beyond the root cellar wall, we discovered a natural cavity in the bedrock extending back approximately 20 feet. The floor of this cavity was earth, and the walls were unworked stone. The space appeared to have been known to the property owners as evidenced by marks on the walls that suggested deliberate concealment work at some point in the past. The cavity was empty of any contents, though the earth floor showed signs of recent disturbance. The report doesn't go into detail about what recent disturbance meant, but Dr. Stratton's separate notes, which were found in his personal papers after he died in 1956, give more information. The earth in the cavity had been dug up and then filled back in. This was clear from the layers that could be seen in the lantern light. The refilled earth was darker and looser than the soil around it. I suggested to Chervos that we dig, but he was hesitant without proper legal permission. We did use a rod to probe the soil to a depth of about 4 feet, without finding any objects or remains. The decision was made to seal the cavity and get a court order if digging was needed. No digging ever happened. The case file says that in late April 1931, the county prosecutor looked at the evidence and decided that while the disappearance was very suspicious, there wasn't enough evidence to call it a crime. No bodies had been found, and no blood or signs of violence had been found. There was still a chance that the Elbridge family had just left their home for reasons that were never made clear. The case was officially classified as a missing persons investigation, but as time went on and other issues came up, it slowly fell out of the public eye. The property itself fell into legal limbo. Since there were no death certificates and no heirs making claims, the farmstead technically still belonged to Varian Elbridge, but the taxes went unpaid and the land slowly returned to its original state. To forest. In 1945, the state started the process of claiming the property for unpaid taxes, but it was put on hold when a distant cousin of Varian's living in Vermont contested the action. The matter lingered in courts for years, during which time the farmhouse deteriorated, its roof collapsing in the winter of 1951. But the story of the Elbridge family did not end with their disappearance. Over the decades, several individuals who showed interest in the case or the property reported unusual experiences. In 1938, a graduate student, Cornelius Marsh, a student at Dartmouth College, got permission to look at the papers found in the quarry house as part of his thesis on farming in New Hampshire in the 1800s. Marsh stayed at the property for 3 days, staying in a boarding house in Cornish. His landlady, Mrs. Edith Howell, later said that Marsh came back each night more and more upset. On the third night, he showed up for dinner looking shaken and said he would be cutting his research short and going back to Handover right away. When asked, he would only say that some records are not meant to be read and that some places carry the weight of their own history too heavily. Marsh did finish his thesis, but the final work did not mention the Elbridge documents. In a letter to his thesis advisor, which is kept in the Dartmouth archives, Marsh wrote, "I must respectfully request that my access to the Elbridge materials be stricken from my research acknowledgments. I cannot in good conscience reference documents whose contents I found profoundly disturbing. It was disturbing not because of what they said, but because of what they showed about the mental state of the people who wrote them. The later journals of Varian Elbridge in particular show a mind that is either deeply deluded or, worse, very clear about things that should not be thought about." The local historical society tried to save what was left of the farmhouse and quarry house in 1952 so that they could be seen as places of historical interest. A group of volunteers came in June to look over the buildings and start work on stabilizing them. The project was called off after only a week. Roland Taft, the project coordinator, sent a TUR report to the board of the Historical Society. "Even though we wanted to, we found that the site wasn't good for preservation work. The problems with the structure are worse than first thought. Suggest that the property be allowed to deteriorate naturally." A note in the meeting minutes, on the other hand, says that one board member who had talked to a few of the volunteer crew members heard stories about tools going missing, noises coming from the quarry house when no one was there, and a general sense that something was wrong that made it impossible to keep working. Dr. Millicent Hargrove, a historian at the University of New Hampshire who studies the social history of rural New England, did the most thorough investigation of the Elbridge case in later years. Starting in 1957, Dr. Hargrove spent 2 years studying the family, talking to people who were still alive at the time, and looking at the documents that are available. She worked very hard and wrote hundreds of pages of notes and analysis, but her results were never made public. Dr. Hargrove's co-workers at the university say that she suddenly stopped her research in early 1959 and asked for a sabbatical, which she spent traveling in Europe. When she got back, she wouldn't talk about the Elbridge project. A letter that was found in Dr. Hargrove's personal belongings after she died in 1968 gives us some information about her choice. Written to a co-worker, but it looks like not sent. The letter said, "I have come to the conclusion that some historical inquiries open doors that are better left closed. My research into the Elbridge family revealed patterns that extend far beyond a single disappearance in 1931. I traced the family history back to Jedediah's arrival in New Hampshire in 1842. And what I discovered suggests that the events of 1931 were not an aberration, but a culmination. The documents kept by successive generations of Eldridges reveal a family bound by what they perceived as an inescapable obligation, one that demanded increasing costs with each generation. Whether this obligation was real or delusional is perhaps beside the point. What matters is that they believed in it absolutely, and that belief shaped every decision they made. I cannot, in good conscience, publish work that might encourage others to investigate further. There are truths that serve no purpose in being known in her notes, which were donated to the university archives, with the stipulation that they remained sealed for 50 years. Dr. Hargrove noted strange things about the Elbridge family's past. Every generation of Elbridges who owned the property had unexplained deaths or disappearances. Jedediah's wife disappeared in 1858. The official story was that she left her husband and went back east, but there were no records of her life after that. Nathaniel Elbridge's twin brother drowned in 1882 in a way that the coroner said was consistent with deliberate submersion. Nathaniel himself died in 1919, the strange circumstances that were mentioned before. His last words to his doctor were, "I have kept the covenant, but I fear my son lacks the necessary resolve." What was this covenant? Dr. Hargrove's notes suggest she thought it came from Jedediah Elbridge, but it's not clear what made it happen. In his earliest journals from 1842 and 1843, Jedediah talks about previous claims on the land and acknowledges previous residents. In an entry from July 1843, he wrote, "Walk the boundaries today with the surveyor." He talked about the strange shape of the stone near the northwest corner, saying it wasn't natural, but rather the work of people who lived there before, maybe the original people of this area. When I asked more questions, he became evasive and said only that certain places have responsibilities for those who settle there. I don't believe this is superstition, but I do have to think about what responsibilities I have taken on by buying this land. By 1844, Jedediah's entries showed that he was becoming more and more interested in what he called the arrangement. He wrote, "I have come to understand that mere legal ownership conveys rights, but also demands duties. The land has memory, and that memory must be respected. There are practices I must observe, rituals of acknowledgement if harmony is to be maintained. This is not superstition, but recognition of forces that predate our laws and customs." Dr. Hargrove noted that Jedediah never clearly described what these practices or rituals involved, but his journals show a system of regular observances, walks along the property boundaries at certain times of year, upkeep of certain stone markers, and keeping the area beyond the root cellar sealed, except for occasional acknowledgments. His journals also say that he taught these practices to his son, stressing how important they were. "I have taught Nathaniel the necessary observances. He is still young and questions their purpose, but he will understand in time. Some traditions must be kept, even if we don't fully understand them, because breaking them could have consequences we can't afford to find out about." The pattern of each generation passing down mysterious obligations, along with the pattern of loss and disappearance, suggests that the Elbridges lived under the weight of beliefs that grew more oppressive over time. By Varian's generation, these beliefs had apparently solidified into an absolute conviction that certain acts were required regardless of personal cost. Evidence suggests that in the final months before the disappearance, Varian had become convinced that a critical obligation was due. His journal entries from late 1930 repeatedly mention the cycle completing and terms coming due. In December, he wrote, "The accounting is at hand." Evidence indicates that in the months leading up to his disappearance, Varian had become convinced that a very important duty was due. His journal entries from late 1930 repeatedly mention the cycle completing and terms coming due. In December, he wrote, "The accounting is at hand. What was promised must be given. Imogene doesn't get it. But you don't have to understand. Only following the rules matters. We have to keep the covenant, or else. The family will lose what they have." Nim. What could make a man go to such lengths? Dr. Hargrove's analysis indicated that Varian, raised in isolation by a father who instilled in him a sense of inescapable duty, developed a worldview wherein personal desires and typical human concerns were subordinate to the perceived demands of the covenant. Letters in the archive between Varian and his father show that Nathaniel kept telling his son, "You are not just a man living on land. You are a steward of something older." Always remember that your life is not entirely yours. We are all links in a chain, and each one must stay strong. Imogene must have had a terrible last few months in a marriage that had turned into a prison of strict rules and demands that made no sense. Her last letter to her sister, which was written on February 15, 1931, showed how desperate she was. I write to you with a heavy heart and a request that I don't want to make. Please ask if I don't write again. After my health, I'm afraid I've gotten involved in things I don't understand and can't see a way out of. Varian is different now, or maybe I can only see clearly now what was always there. He talks about duties and responsibilities that I don't get, and when I ask him questions, he gets cold and distant. That doesn't help. He looks just as stuck as I do, but he doesn't show any signs of fighting back. I feel like I'm living in a house where the walls are closing in and no one can hear me. Prudence Kavanaugh, Imogene's sister, did try to visit the farm in mid-March 1931 because she was worried about the letter's tone. She came from Manchester and got to Cornish on March 17th. But when she tried to get to the property, she found that a tree had fallen and blocked the road. Local men offered to clear it, but Mrs. Kavanaugh was in a hurry, and the postmaster told her that the Elbridges were known for being self-sufficient. So she decided to go back to Manchester and write instead. Her letter was sent in March. 19th was found in the mail that hadn't been picked up yet. It was never opened. The last known contact with the Elbridge family came from an unexpected source, Gavin Pritchard, a timber surveyor who was working in the area in early March 1931, wrote in his field journal on March 8th that he had seen a man on the forest road that led to the Elbridge property. Pritchard didn't know the man, but he was walking away from the farmstead with purpose and looked messy. "Hey, Pritchard," called out a hello out of curiosity. The man stopped, turned a little, and Pritchard later said he saw a face that looked very sad or sick, pale, drawn, and with eyes that seemed to look through rather than at me. The man didn't say anything, just turned and kept walking. At the time, Pritchard didn't think much of it, just that there were strange people in the back country. But after the disappearance became known, he told Sheriff Voss about the encounter. The physical. Pritchard's description could have fit Thaddeus Elbridge, but the surveyor couldn't be sure. If it was Thaddeus that Pritchard saw, it raises troubling questions. Was he running away? Had something already happened at the farmstead? Or was he perhaps on some last errand related to whatever Varian had planned? The mystery deepened when investigators checking the property's perimeter found a small clearing about 3 miles into the forest along a barely discernible path. Simple, stone Chiron. The fresh dirt around the base showed that someone had been there recently. When Deputy Henry took the Chiron apart, he found nothing underneath it except a piece of paper wrapped in oilcloth with a single line written in what looked like Thaddeus's handwriting. "I could not stop what was set in motion. May those who come after us forgive what we could not prevent." This note, Exhibit M in the investigation file, has been analyzed extensively. The phrase "what was set in motion" suggests events out of Thaddeus's hands. But the fact that he was there to help build the Chiron shows that he still had the ability to leave a message. Was he involved in what happened, or was he a victim who was able to give a final testimony before dying? The forensic examination of the farmstead in 1931 was thorough, but it didn't give many clear answers. There was no blood and no signs of a fight. The way the household was set up suggested that they were getting ready for something rather than a sudden crisis. In Varian's study, the last entry in his ledger from March 10, 1931, simply said, "All accounts settled. The conditions are met. The promise has been kept." What comes next is change, not an end. He had drawn a simple geometric design below this entry. It was made up of concentric circles with lines coming out from the center. This symbol was not found anywhere else in his journals. Dr. Stratton, the medical examiner, stayed involved in the case longer than most because he was interested in the parts that couldn't be explained. In letters to his co-workers, he said he was angry that there was no physical evidence. In a letter from May 1931, he wrote, "The complete absence of human remains, along with the evidence of habitation up to a certain point, is a puzzle from a medical point of view. 3 adult human beings do not simply cease to exist without leaving some trace. Either they left the property alive, which raises the question of where they went and why no subsequent sighting has occurred, or they met their end there. This makes you wonder how all the evidence of that end could have been so well hidden. After the investigation, the property gained a bad reputation that kept people away. Kids in Cornish were told not to go near the old Elbridge place. Of course, local teens sometimes dared each other to go near the ruins, especially after dark, but few made it past the trees. Those who did said the atmosphere was oppressive and they felt unwelcome and like they were trespassing. The state finally took the property in 1963 for unpaid taxes. After the legal battles were over, the farmhouse ruins were bulldozed and the land was added to a state forest management plan. The quarry house, which was built more solidly, stood for several more years before falling victim to weather and neglect in the winter of 1967. Workers clearing the site reported finding nothing of value in the rubble, but they did find, though this was not officially reported, that the floor of the quarry house hid a stone-lined chamber about 6 feet deep. The chamber was empty, but the markings on the walls made the work crew uneasy enough that they filled the space with rubble and concrete instead of leaving it open. The cavity behind the root cellar was also sealed during the property clearing. A decision was made documented. The documents and journals had long since been moved to the state archives, so all that was left was rubble. What they did find, though this was not officially reported, was that the floor of the quarry house hid a stone-lined chamber about 6 feet deep. The chamber was empty, but the work crew found the markings on the walls so disturbing that they filled the space with rubble and concrete instead of leaving it open. The cavity behind the root cellar was also sealed during the property clearing. A decision was made documented in state forestry records to fill it with concrete. The reason was safety concerns about unstable rock formations. Official records don't say if any digging was done before the sealing, but a worker who was interviewed years later by a local newspaper doing a retrospective on unsolved mysteries of the region said they were told to fill the hole quickly and not look at it closely. When pressed, he would only say that some places feel wrong in a way that makes. You want to get rid of them as soon as possible. Today, the only signs of the Elbridge farmstead are small depressions in the forest floor and the occasional piece of foundation stone that can be seen among the leaves. The access road has been reclaimed by the forest. A hiker who doesn't know the history would walk through the area without realizing that a family once lived there, that lives were lived and then erased from the land, but maybe not completely erased. Park rangers who work there. The state forest has sometimes recorded strange things about the area in their logs. For example, compass readings that don't seem to make sense, a lack of wildlife in a certain area around the old farmstead site, and hikers saying that the paths seemed different on the way back than they did on the way there. These reports are rare and can easily be explained by natural causes like magnetic anomalies in the bedrock, the density of the forest, or simple human error. They are not looked into, just noted, and the forest continues its work of concealing what once was. In 1964, a researcher from the New Hampshire Historical Society attempted to compile a comprehensive history of disappeared communities and homesteads in the state. The Elbridge case was to be included as a notable example. However, when the researcher, a young man named Oliver Wright, visited the archives to review the case file, he found that several key documents had been removed. Sheriff Voss's complete report was there, as were most of the. The archive clerk couldn't explain why the journals from the Quarry House, especially those written by Varian between 1929 and 1931, were missing. She only said that Dr. Hargrove had checked them out in 1959 and never returned them. They tried to get in touch with Dr. Hargrove at the time, but she was on sabbatical, so they never got the documents back. Wainwright did manage to interview one of the surviving deputies who had worked on the 1931 investigation, Malcolm Hendry, who was retired. Henry, who was 81 years old and lived in Laconia, agreed to talk about the case, even though his memories had faded. What he did remember clearly was a conversation he had with Sheriff Voss shortly after the investigation was over. Voss had said, "Some cases you solve, some you don't, and some you're glad to walk away from. This is the third type. I don't think we'd want to know what happened to the Elbridges, no matter what. Might be able to find out. There are times when not getting an answer is better than getting a certain kind of answer." Wainwright pushed Hendry to explain what Voss might have meant, and the old deputy got uncomfortable. Finally, he said, "We found things in that property that we didn't put in the official report. Nothing illegal, but the way that house was set up was troubling. It was like living in a carefully built prison. Everything was measured, documented, and controlled. And the journals I saw before they went missing showed that Varian's mind had convinced him that normal human life was less important than some imagined greater purpose. Sheriff Voss and I talked about whether Varian might have thought that fulfilling this imagined purpose required the kind of final act that people can convince themselves is justified when their thinking has become so distorted. Henry's suggestion that Varian, in the grip of a delusional system he inherited and reinforced over generations, had taken some final action regarding himself and the other household members. This is a logical explanation, but it is still unproven. Without bodies and direct evidence, it is still speculation. The cavity behind the root cellar, which was sealed before proper excavation, might have held answers, or it might have just been filled with dirt and stone. The Elbridges, having indeed left the property by unknown means for unknown destinations. One last piece of evidence was found. In 1966, workers renovating a church basement in Manchester found a small wooden box that had fallen behind built-in shelving. It contained personal items belonging to Imogene Prescott from before her marriage, such as photographs, letters, and a diary from her youth. Also in the box was an envelope addressed to Imogene's sister, Prudence Kavanaugh. It was postmarked March 1931, but never sent. The letter inside was written by Imogene. It is short and scary. "Prudence, I write this knowing it may never reach you. Varian has locked the door." He talks about completion and covenant, words that mean nothing to me except the end of everything I have known. That has already accepted. I am told I must as well. There is no help coming. This place, this family, it has all been a slow consuming of lives for purposes I will never understand. If I am not found, know that I did not go willingly into whatever darkness Varian has prepared. Some prisons have no walls yet, are still unavoidable. Prudence Kavanaugh's great-granddaughter found the letter while cleaning out the church building to sell it. She called the New Hampshire State Police, and the letter was added to the cold case file. In his summary, an officer who looked at the whole case in light of this new evidence said, "The letter gives us a glimpse into Imogene Elbridge's mental state in the days before the family went missing, confirming that she felt trapped and in danger because of what her husband did and believed, but it doesn't give any hard proof of what really happened." The case remains unsolved. The New Hampshire State Police still have the Elbridge case file open, but there hasn't been an active investigation in decades. There isn't much physical evidence. The property has been cleared. The documents are incomplete. and the witnesses have all died. What remains is a documented example of how belief systems can be passed down from generation to generation. Together with being alone and having a rigid mind, can cause things to happen that are hard to explain. In one of her last notes before giving up her research, Dr. Hargrove wrote, "The question is not really what happened to the Elbridges. What happens when people become so sure that they have to do something for someone or something else that they forget that they are human and that other people are human too? The Eldridges lived for generations with the burden of what they believed was a duty that couldn't be avoided. It doesn't matter if that responsibility was real or not. What matters is that they built their whole lives around it. In doing so, they built a closed system, a delusion that kept growing stronger with each generation. The disappearance in 1931 was probably unavoidable. It was the last step in a line of reasoning that had been building for 90 years. There are a lot of different ideas about what happened to the Elbridge family, some of which are scary. Some suggest that they just left their homes and started new lives somewhere else under fake names. However, this doesn't explain why they couldn't access any financial accounts or get in touch with family members. Some people say murder-suicide, with Vian killing his brother and wife before killing himself. The bodies were hidden somewhere on the property, but no one ever found them. The evidence of Varian's worsening mental health and his obsession with keeping his promises gave this theory some support, but doesn't have any physical proof. A third theory, which isn't talked about much but is in some of the investigation notes, says that someone outside the family might have hurt them. Maybe someone who knew about the family's cash withdrawals, or someone who was angry with them. But the fact that there are no signs of struggle, the house is in order, and there is no evidence of theft, goes against this. The most troubling theory, which even those who thought about it didn't fully explain, is that Vian thought. He needed to do one last thing to keep the covenant, and he did it with the help, or at least the acceptance, of the other family members. The cavity behind the root cellar served a purpose that no one wanted to look too closely at. In the end, there isn't much that can be said for sure. The Elbridge family lived on a piece of land in rural New Hampshire for 3 generations. Every generation went through losses and tragedies. In March 1931, the last generation vanished without a word, leaving behind a well-organized home and scattered papers that point to a deep psychological disturbance centered on beliefs about duties to something that was never clearly defined. The forest has taken back the property after years of being stuck in legal limbo and slowly falling apart. The story has become part of local history and is sometimes told again, but it is becoming less well known as people who were involved in the events die. But the case files are still there. The archive documents keep the voices of Jedediah, Nathaniel, and Varian Elbridge, each of whom was dealing with what they thought was an inherited burden. They keep Imogene's letters, which show how she slowly came to understand that she was stuck in a situation she couldn't change. They keep the notes of the people who looked into the disappearance. Their anger at finding so many puzzle pieces that didn't fit together to make a whole picture. A short note that was found in the Elbridge family records may be the best epitaph for them. Sheriff Foss's own journal, found after he died in 1948. The entry from April 20th, 1931, says, "Closed the Elbridge case today officially at least. Cannot help but feel we have only documented a mystery, not solved it. Spoke with the priest in Cornish about the family. He said they went to church sometimes but were polite but distant. He said that Vian once asked him if faith in God could get in the way of other duties and what a man should do when he is torn between God's law and what he said," as previous claims. The priest told people to put their Christian duties above all else. Varian said thank you and never brought it up again. As I walked away from that property, I felt something I don't often feel in my job. relief at leaving a place behind, and the belief that some questions are not worth asking. The Elbridges think they were bound by something. Their belief made it real enough to eat them up, even if it wasn't. The Elbridge farmstead used to be where the forest is now. People who walked through didn't know the story. The seasons change. It snows and then melts. Leaves pile up and break down. The stones that used to make up walls and foundations are sinking deeper into the ground. The land goes on with its old ways, not caring about what people think. And in the state archives, in folders that have turned yellow with age, the Elbridge case file is waiting. A list of things that happened and questions that still need to be answered. A reminder that not every story ends in a way that makes sense, and not every mystery gets solved. To look into. Maybe that's how it should be. Some stories don't end with answers or revelations. They end with silence and the realization that we may never know. No one can find out what happened to the Elbridge family, no matter what. They stayed the same as when they left, present in the record but not in the world. Their voices are preserved in documents, but their bodies are gone. All that is left is the echo of lives lived under the weight of beliefs that gave them no peace and an ending that gave them no peace. Evidence.